Hello and welcome to Solving Climate Change Once and for All. I'm Bi Huye, and thanks so much for joining this online series where we're talking to experts and entrepreneurs to learn what we can apply from their work to climate action and, more importantly, climate justice. You'll leave with the number one thing you can do to make a positive impact. I'm super excited to be joined today by Cynthia Pong, founder of Embrace Change, social justice superhero, and feminist career coach. Thanks so much for joining us, Cynthia.
Thanks for having me, Bea. It's really great to be here.
So we're going to talk about different structures in our society today. We're going to talk about that one thing you can do to make a positive impact and lessons from your entrepreneurship journey that I'm sure our listeners will benefit from. I want to start, though, with the previous life you lived as a public defender in the Bronx before you started Embrace Change. Can you tell us about the day you started your work in career coaching and kind of what was the tipping point for you to take that leap of faith?
Sure. So it wasn't exactly one day where it all happened. It was a process over time and more organic. But as I was in my third and fourth year of practicing as a public defender, I started burning out, and by year 6, I was like, I gotta go. There was a moment I always think back on when it clicked to me that I was no longer doing the job the way I wanted to. I was in court with a client and their family, and I just realized I had become an apologist for the system that I wanted to be dismantling. So I always think back to that moment that, kind of flipped the switch for me. So after I left, I took this unpaid sabbatical and I did some soul searching and things like that. And I got it into my head that I wanted to work for myself. So I started my own business, and I had to pivot that a few times because the first version of my business did not work out. Second version also was not a good fit. And then I realized that I missed working with people one-on-one and helping them problem solve around their careers. And so that's how I started the career coaching, which then felt like another switch that was flipped, and everything clicked into place. And from there, it's just grown, and I've, gone further into it.
I love that almost origin story in terms of having that epiphany while you were in court and then having the courage to turn that into something that's so successful and impactful today. I'm really curious. Yeah, definitely. I'm really curious about this parallel between the feminist work and career coaching that you're doing and climate activism. They have quite a lot in common in terms of being seemingly invisible problems. They're systemic in nature. They're easy to deprioritize by way of causes from the institutions that hold power. So what have you seen be effective in your work as a feminist career coach that's applicable to the climate fight?
Right. So I specialize in working with women of color who are no stranger to these invisible and seemingly intractable forces at play that continue to reverberate in their lives, professional and not, and are oppressive. So part of my work with them is making peace or finding solace with the following things. One is that it is going to be a long haul. This is a long-term fight, and I often think of my good friend, who's also a woman of color and an emergency room physician. Her email signature says, if your goals can be achieved within your lifetime, then you're not aiming high enough or dreaming big enough, something to that end. Yeah, so I think about that a lot because it applies, I think, to climate justice, social justice, and gender justice. So that's number one, is to remember that. Number two is really to think of things in terms of what you can control and what you cannot. So while we may not want to admit it, there are things that are outside of our control. And then within that, there's things we can influence, we can try to influence. And then there's things beyond that really, as an individual, you really can't have much of an impact on. So if you can align where those sort of circles and that delineation is for you with your actual reality, then I think you can find a lot of peace in that. But if it's misaligned, like if you, and a lot of clients that I work with feel this way, if you feel like you should be able to control more than you actually can, like other people, how their boss treats them, that's really not within your control, somebody else's actions. You can try to influence it, but you don't hold the power and the key to that at the end of the day. So realigning themselves with that reality helps maintain, I think, our mental health. And all of that, remembering that is key to fighting burnout, I think, and not getting too discouraged. Something that I wasn't really successful at doing when I was a public defender, to be honest.
Wow. Yeah, those are super applicable tips and really insights from work in social justice, work in systems that are not supporting the causes that we're fighting for.
Yeah.
And I think in particular, this concept of burnout and how you kind of persist through that, which we can talk about later.
Yeah,
I,
absolutely.
I think wearing your entrepreneur hat, I'm curious in a similar vein, what do you think is applicable from what you've learned building a business from scratch to the successful point that it's at now, and doing that in a space that is so impactful and meaningful and takes so much of your energy and time?
Thanks. You are so generous with your words. It means a lot. So there are, I think, a lot of lessons that can be learned from the entrepreneurial experience, and I define things like that broadly. So I don't think you need to be a business owner to be entrepreneurial or have that side to you.
Right.
Lessons I learned, I can share three. So one is to not get too tied to a particular method or project or initiative that's going towards your bigger goal. That's because you're going to need to probably pivot and change and tweak and adjust things as you test it out. And the testing is like the practice of, whether it's selling to customers or providing the service to your clients, like going through beta and different phases like that, and not being too tied to your original concept, because it might not resonate with the people you actually want to work with or the people you actually want to serve. So that's number one. Be a little flexible with your approach. Number two is being really willing to experiment and be creative. So this is a combination of that first point, but also bringing in like a little bit of resiliency and drawing upon creative problem solving to continue to move yourself towards that goal, not get discouraged and burn yourself out, but to be willing to try new things towards that same goal. And then the third is you need to be able to put yourself in the position of somebody else. So whether that's your target customer, your target client, whoever you're negotiating with, somebody that you're trying to persuade to join your fight within climate justice, you need to be able to understand what it looks like from where they sit. That way you will be more equipped to try to influence them, because they're outside of your control, influence them to see things in a similar way to you, align your goals, put pressure, like whatever it is, to sort of move the needle on whatever fight you're talking about. So those are three tips. Sure.
I love them, and I can see them play out so much in the climate space in terms of what we thought would work to slow down the changing climate, right? In terms of the technologies, the procurement methods, the way that we thought we could scale up renewable power and think about alternative fuels. And that's just in the energy landscape. It's not talking again about the social equity aspect of what we are or are not doing. And so not being tied to one strategy, realizing that that's not working, and then moving on to something else, and being flexible and open in that way. And then really importantly, to think about the audience that is debating facts and doesn't agree on the fact that we are experiencing this climate crisis. And so understanding even where they're coming from before you can start to build a bridge and think about what are we solving for here and how can we do it collectively rather than
Right.
from opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. It's so challenging. I mean, when you were saying that, flat earthers popped into my head, like this is the level that some of this discourse is happening on, and we can't really ignore it forever.
We can't. And that's why we have people like you out there. So, another parallel I think that's really quite stark between feminist and social equity work and climate justice work is this starting point of limited resources. It's the same with sustainability, which is primed in this concept of do more with less. We
Mm-hmm.
can only have so many diversity hires, or there's only this number of managerial positions, or you get this many resources to come up with the solution. So
Right.
I'm wondering what you've seen be successful in working through this scarcity mindset, which is kind of plaguing a lot of the solution and innovation that we need to have happen.
Yeah, this is a big question, and I'm glad we're talking about this topic because shifting from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset is something I think about a lot. I teach these negotiation workshops and webinars, and my co-teacher for that, Nora Rahimian, who's a creative consultant, we both talk about the importance of recognizing when we're having these scarcity mindset thoughts, like there's not enough clients for me, I'm not going to make enough revenue from my business is going to fail, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And recognizing it, not punishing yourself for having those thoughts, but then shifting it to an abundance mindset. Like, I'm going to find a way. There are people who still need me. I'm going to, figure this out so that my business can be sustainable. So one example of this, because we're talking in the middle of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic,
Right.
from our homes, and I know like a lot of my colleagues in the coaching space are feeling really anxious, like their
Mhm.
businesses are going to fail because there's this feeling like everyone is holding on tighter to their dollars right now. And there
Mhm.
can also be this feeling that investing in your career through hiring a coach for public speaking, for career strategy, for leadership negotiation is a luxury good.
Right.
Which, we can debate that, but like there is this kind of perception out there that it's like, well, I'm gonna meet my basic needs first, like the food, shelter, all that stuff.
Maslow's
So
hierarchy.
yeah, in that kind of in this landscape that we're in right now, I have this colleague who does very similar work to me. Like our work overlaps a lot, but I made this sort of freebie resource for people who are looking for women of color who are looking for jobs in this time and who are probably very, very stressed out because it feels like hiring is down. You got to pay the bills, just everything, right?
Mhm.
So in making this guide, I made it a point to link to my colleague Niatu, who specializes in resume and LinkedIn review and revamp and stuff. I also do that for my clients. So like some people might be like, well, that's stupid, Cynthia. Why would you create something and then send people away from you to a colleague? I don't see it that way at all. I see it as I get a chance to demonstrate my value to whoever is reading my freebie. Also, I get a chance to simultaneously promote and support my colleague, another person of color in this space who offers, similar but uniquely different services and delivered in another way. So in that way, I'm letting Niatu like be exposed to my audience. Also, like he knowing that I've done this is going to tell other people, oh, check out my colleague's guide. I'm mentioned in it. So I get exposure in his audience. And by doing that, we've created like a win-win situation.
Right.
So, that's one illustration of how we can start to think about problem solving in the abundance mindset rather than from a scarcity position.
That's such a powerful example, and I love that you're coming from a place of giving. It's something I hope more climate companies and other organizations adopt because you cannot change a system with one player or one person, and it
Yeah.
really needs that collaborative effort and dynamic to think
Yeah.
about what are all the different things we can each bring, even if some of them overlap, but
Right.
to really make sure that we're attacking it from all angles, or that we're embracing what we can all do from those different dimensions to come up with the best solution. So that's
Hmm.
a really awesome way to look at it.
Thanks.
So for our listeners, I think there's some interest in terms of all of the maybe horror stories you may have heard inside a courtroom, from your clients who come to you needing to vent about what they've experienced in a boardroom, daily microaggressions that might turn into just overall oppression. Uh,
Yeah.
what's what's the most shocking thing you've learned in your work that you think is necessary for people to know about?
Mm. So I have to admit that I don't find things too shocking anymore. I think because I've always been pretty jaded and skeptical since I got politicized in college. So the bar for me is like not in, I think, a normal place, not in an average place, let's say.
Right.
However, there are many, many things that anger me. Pretty much most of the things that we hear about in the news. There's endless examples, but one that comes to mind that's recent is, when I heard about the retaking of Mashpee Wampanoag lands in, what is commonly known now as Rhode Island.
Mhm.
This happened as the COVID-19 crisis was really getting like deeper and deeper, and people were so hyper focused on that, including Mashpee Wampanoag people who are like trying to make sure that they can stay healthy through this pandemic, like the rest of us. Although they're like, they have fewer resources and they're in a worse position than a lot of us who are more privileged. And Trump and the administration went and took their land. Uh, I was totally appalled. I was so angry. I think I like really just felt numb when I heard about it, and I heard about it a few days after it had already happened.
Mm.
Um, so I had like nowhere to really take this anger and channel it. But then like once I'd calmed down a little bit, I thought about those like circles, right? What I can control, what's beyond my control, I can try to influence, and then what's really, really beyond my control. Um, so what I did was, my friend who had told me, the same one, McKinney, as the email signature
Mhm.
person, told me about this. So I signed the petition that she had sent me. I donated some money to the Mashpee Wampanoag Nation. Then I posted about it on my Instagram, and I know a bunch of people wrote back and they had not heard, so that did have some impact in spreading the news about it. And then I called my senators the next day, and I was like, okay, this is what I can do as one individual, and have been thinking about it since, but like in all practical ways have moved on to like doing other things. So this is one example of how, when faced with things that are honestly triggering and traumatic and horrifying, like, one way that you can try to break it down for yourself, do what you can, and not burn yourself out. Of course, there's lots of other terrible things that have happened too, recently, but as one example.
And I think it's a very timely example that demonstrates time and time again in times of crisis, whether that's a climate crisis or the healthcare crisis with this global pandemic we're facing right now, that
Yeah,
marginalized populations disproportionately bear the brunt of these effects. And
right.
administration or not, just in terms of their location, their income level, stuff that may or may not be in their control, where they
Right.
are now working through it at a very different level than other people who have access to resources. So I think that's a really striking example um, between these types of crisis and
Hmm.
why we need an aspect of social justice in the climate work that we're doing, or really in any sort of social work that we take upon ourselves.
Yes, I mean 100%. I mean, I I'm constantly just thinking about how racism and capitalism and all these other systems and forms of oppression pervade everything. And they inform everything. And so for those of us who do have power, a voice, a platform, the ability to, say these things without endangering our person, like it's our responsibility to remember um, the other people, to think about them, to bring them into the conversation, to center them in the conversation, defer to them, all these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good tee up to what we've promised our listeners to share, right? What's the number one thing that you can do to combat climate change in this systemic world of challenges that we live in? And really, again, not just climate change, but to
Mhm.
champion the climate justice aspect of that work.
Right. So the backbone and the center of climate justice work, I think, is exactly those communities and those individuals I was talking about before. They tend to be overly, there's a higher representation of people of color, women of color, poor communities, communities that are directly affected by climate change acutely. And so for those folks, the number one thing is to make sure that you're able to replenish your own reserves so that you can continue doing the work. Because, like we said in the beginning, this is a long haul, it's a long game. And if you're burnt out, you cannot continue the work, and that doesn't serve your greater goal or purpose. I have this colleague who is another coach and a woman of color, and also a mother and a daughter and everything. And when, as one example of why I make this my number one takeaway, because it sounds basic, but it's really not necessarily. When she went back home for the holidays a few months ago, back when we could travel, it took her fully 2 weeks to remember how to relax,
Wow.
because she's so used to always taking care of other people, taking care of her child, taking care of her parents, taking care of her spouse, taking care of her clients, her business. Everything is putting other people first. And so if you're always doing that, you almost forget how to put yourself first and how
Mhm.
to let others take care of you. So that's 100% my number one takeaway is you need to be able to learn what works for you in terms of self-care and to make it a practice, a regular practice for yourself. Um, then once you're in a stronger place, like you can make these other decisions much easier. Like you can see more clearly what's within your control, what you can influence, what's beyond your control, and then do what you can and let other people also chip in. For the rest of us who aren't in that category, then it's up to us to help support the women of color and the people of color and the queer folks and everyone who is carrying an extra burden in this. Like we need to take some of that burden on ourselves. And that doesn't necessarily mean asking them what they need for help, because that's also putting the burden back on them to delegate to you, which is work. So, make sure to pitch in a truly helpful way, give money, give resources, step aside, and figure out what actually can help without reburdening that person.
That is such an insightful comment. And I think it's so meaningful to hear for a lot of well meaning intention that often becomes more burden, like you
Yeah,
said, or even not inviting people into solutions, but kind of prescribing, even if it's from a well meaning place. And we
right,
see that at scale with a lot of the um, climate change and environmental solutions that have failed, frankly, around the
right.
world.
Yeah,
So, listening, I think, and really putting that person in the center of what you are solving for is an amazing takeaway. I also love this message of community that you're sharing, right? Look across and see who needs help and what you can do for them in a place of listening first. And if we
mhm,
extend that community to institutions and governments and even corporations, what's
yes.
your message to them about what they can do to mobilize around climate solutions?
Yeah, I think it's so important to talk about this because a lot of times we do tend to be like, well, what can individuals do, and put all the pressure on individuals to make change when we know that the most efficient and effective way to like solve for climate justice is to mobilize the big players. Um, so I'm glad you asked that. I think the number one thing is what you just said, which is listening. I would add, listening and observing, and doing what's right, like the ethical and the moral thing, not always putting the dollar and profits first, not being mostly concerned with maintaining the status quo and how things are. And that means sharing and redistributing power and resources, time, to build a world where everybody has a real chance to thrive and like participate fully, not just be like worried about how they're going to pay their next rent bill, which is so on the top of mind for so many people right now, as they've been laid off, lost their jobs, and everything like that. So as an example of people who are living this out, there are a number of CEOs who have taken massive pay cuts so that they don't have to fire or furlough their staff.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of examples I think you and I were talking about is like FedEx, McDonald's, Disney. There's others, and I even had heard of a CEO from before coronavirus and everything, who took a pay cut and is paid like either 70K or less, so that other people are also paid like an average of 70K or something around there.
Nice.
So yeah, I like that is actually living your values and taking action, not just giving lip service to these things. So that is, I think, what the bigger players, governments, corporations, companies, institutions need to really be doing, and not just talk about doing.
I love that call to action, the really tangible example too of what you can be doing to share the resources and make it feel more equitable every day. I also really appreciate your point of view, and part of the objective of this series is to have voices like yours become part of this dialogue around climate justice. It's not just the technologists or the futurists or the scientists, it's people like you who are championing social justice in your work. And so my question for you is, what are we all missing? What is the one thing everybody is overlooking, particularly as we all have our own networks and echo chambers? What do we all need to hear?
Well, you know me by now, and that I have trouble boiling things down to one. But I will start with I think we must all be missing the fact that we only have one Earth, and that if we mess it up, it's over for all of us.
Yes.
It's mind-boggling to me that, because if we realized that, I think we really would act a different way. There would be a different sense of urgency. There would be, bigger moves being made. But I think as a global community, I guess we don't get that yet. Maybe because it's going to be beyond each of our individual lifetimes, but it's not that far off. Another thing that I also want to give credence to is that I think a lot of us act exactly how you would expect us to, based on who we are, how we've been socialized, where we exist within the intersections of power, race, gender, sexuality, all of these things. So it's that way. It's not shocking that straight white cisgender men who are born into taking over their father's big business and corporation, like they're acting exactly as you would expect, which is to preserve the wealth where it is and the power where it is, and help the people that they know. And those are, because of how we're segregated, like probably going to be people who look like them and come from the same background. So that is, again, not shocking. And then the rest of us, because we're still steeped within capitalism, we're like scrambling to get like a piece of the American dream, which then buys into the bigger system of capitalism, and we play a role of being complicit in it too. So that is something to remember. We're all acting as one would expect if you take into account all of like what makes us who we are. And then like the third thing I guess I would say is we're missing that we're all in this together, because we do tend to exist within our echo chambers and our silos, talk to whoever agrees with us. I'm guilty of it too, you know. But of course we don't. We have to be able to connect with other people that see things from a different vantage point, and build those bridges like you were saying. We got to be able to do that. But we live in a time and in a, I don't know, a set of systems where like even my neighbors like won't make eye contact, and you know, it's when you say hello, it's disturbing. Yeah, so I'll leave it there.
I think that's a hard message to hear, but it is so true. And the truth is necessary. And that's why I so appreciate the perspectives that you brought from your experience and the kind of hard-won lessons that you have from doing this work every day and putting yourself in that position of thinking about what can I do to help? What privileges do I have that I can lend to others who don't have access to those resources? Some of my favorite takeaways, I think, are to think about adopting this abundance mindset, especially if you have a starting point of scarcity, which is something I see really often. Also, this lesson of knowing what you can control, knowing what you can't, and what you really can't. And that boils down into two things, which is then take care of yourself and make that a practice, so it's not burnout and then take care and then burnout and then take care, but a bit more sustainable. And then the second part of that is figure out what action you can channel your anger, your energy, your numbness into, so that you don't stop caring and that you do feel like you're making that impact. And I think that's a very powerful gem to give to our listeners to cope with, you know, very heavy topics that are systemic in nature, whether it's racism or fighting for gender equity or fighting for climate justice. So thank you so much, Cynthia. Personally, I'm so inspired by your work and generosity, and I know our listeners will be too.
Thank you, B. This was super fun. You ask fantastic questions, and your summing up is on point. So it's been an honor. Thank you.